Inspiring Philosophy recently released a video talking about whether or not the story of Jesus is a myth. He conveniently defines myth as simply a story, like a fiction narrative.
So even if there were prior stories of dying and rising gods, that would not mean the resurrection of Jesus is also a work of fiction.
Not only is this unfair to the argument, but it's academically inaccurate. No scholar would define myth in this way. So let's find a more accurate definition of myth, and then apply it to the Christian narrative and determine once and for all, is the story of Jesus a myth? So a simple Google search gives us a better definition than Inspiring Philosophy ever presents. It reads, a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining some natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. Even this definition is better than the one Inspiring Philosophy presents. It's not simply just a fictitious narrative, but we can get more specific in our definition, relying on some scholars. Karen Armstrong has written at length about religion and mythology in her most recent book. I won't go into all the details, but instead present some of her contributions to the definition of the term myth. First is that myths are generally concerned with death. They're almost always connected to ritual. Oftentimes they're about the unknown, and myths speak of another plane of existence. In Neil Burton's book, The Meaning of Myth, he presents another complementary definition of the term. First is that myths oftentimes include an explanation of the past and the development of humanity. They also include an explanation of the origins of humanity and are commonly linked to rituals. As you might have guessed, the narrative of Christ in the Bible in general fits every single definition that we've talked about. It is absolutely linked to ritual, it is concerned with life after death, it talks about the origins of humanity, and also talks about a supernatural realm that's filled with various supernatural entities. So this is one way to identify myth, is just purely based on the definition. Another way is to compare it to documents that we already know or have already categorized as mythological. We should expect similar stories to exist in the overarching body of myth, and here's why. Ultimately, this other plane of existence that myths are referring to are universal. They're not just in one prophet's mind or one shaman's mind. They exist in all of our minds, but certain individuals have a better sensibility to that reality. We used to call this shamans, and shamans most simply are experts in this spirit realm. But of course, this brings to question, what is this spirit realm we're talking about? So this might sound weird, you may have never heard this before, but the spirit realm simply is the world of the unconscious mind. Psychedelics, meditation, hypnosis, lucid dreaming, sensory deprivation all get us to the same exact place based on brain scans. They allow the unconscious mind and the conscious mind to collide and interact. This is what happens when the shaman takes ayahuasca, the Christian engages in meditative prayer, or the hunter-gatherer spends a weekend in a pitch black, dark cave undergoing sensory deprivation. So this other realm filled with these other creatures, these symbols, these visions, is really the world of the unconscious mind, and since we're all built similarly psychologically and physiologically, we all have similar concepts, characters, ideas that exist within this realm. For this reason, we should expect some similarities in the body of mythology if they are genuine experiences of the unconscious mind. So if we're trying to determine whether or not a specific narrative fits within this body of mythology, we can kind of use this logic in reverse. Since these are all explorations of the unconscious mind, and the unconscious mind is something that we all share, we should expect some similarities in various myths if they truly are mythological narratives. Unsurprisingly, this is exactly what we see in the Hebrew myth and the myth of Christianity. For example, Christianity is not the first myth with a resurrection narrative. It's not the first myth to present God as incarnate. It's also not the first to have a guy walk on water, turn water into wine, or even flood the entire earth. It's not the first to have conceptions of hell or heaven or even the Garden of Eden. Jesus is not the first to be born of a virgin and perform miracles. Many have done this before, and some have even done it after. When focusing on the flood narrative in particular, we see unbelievable similarities to the narrative that is presented in the first recorded myth, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. In both stories, we have an angry god or gods unleash a massive flood, and before doing so, they notify one person on Earth and give him instructions to create an ark for their families and animals. Everything is destroyed, and they must repopulate the world. In both stories, we even have the detail of releasing a bird see if it returns in order to tell if the flood levels have decreased to the point where land is available to park a ship. You really have two options to explain these similarities. First is that the biblical authors are copying other contemporary narratives. Second, and the explanation that I like, is that these biblical authors were exploring the same areas of the unconscious mind, thus coming out with similar stories and narratives. Both are equally troubling for Christian dogma. If you take the first option, you must affirm that there's some truth, some divine truth in each of these various stories. You must take it as a revelation from God himself through the writers of the Epic of Gilgamesh. If you're copying these narratives, then in some sense, those narratives that you have copied were correct. This is a massive problem for a religion that excludes all other perspectives except for their own. And then if the biblical authors are copying a variety of different texts that are contemporary with them, what about the rest of those texts? Who's picking and choosing what gets to be considered divinely inspired and what is not? If you take the other option, it's perhaps even more troublesome. You then have to affirm that the Christian texts are just like any other work of mythology. They're explorations of the unconscious mind, and we can categorize it the same way we categorize the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example. Another place we can look for evidence of the mythological nature of Christianity is in its origins. For now, I want to focus on the death and resurrection narrative that is so dogmatic in Christianity and why it's most likely a myth, not recorded history. First, as many of the early Christians didn't even believe that the death and resurrection was legitimate. They saw it as more of a symbolic event, not a literal death and resurrection of a guy who was God. They also saw Jesus as a spiritual leader, not God incarnate. So even from the beginning, we have a discontinuity between different accounts of what actually happened. Many Christians will appeal to the Gospels that are in the Bible and say, look, this was the consensus at the time. Even from the beginning, they believed that Jesus resurrected. But in reality, this ignores other traditions that existed alongside this specific Christian perspective, such as the Gnostics. They understood the event as symbolic and mythological in nature. Another thing that brings into question this early narrative that was proposed by early churches, that Christ was the Son of God and that he rose from the dead, is conflicts of interest. This is a good question to ask it, honestly, any time. Who stands to gain the most from this being true? Undoubtedly, it's the apostles. They get to be the fingers of God, the fingers of a divine being here on earth. They become God's representatives. What greater power could one have? What greater power could one want than being God's mouthpiece on earth? I think this is a massive conflict of interest that is oftentimes overlooked and absolutely cast doubt on that narrative of Christianity, that it's not a myth. Lastly, I want to talk about something Inspiring Philosophy mentioned in his video, supposedly supporting the fact that Christ was not a myth, but he tried to make himself look mythological so that he would fit in. So Inspiring Philosophy says, with a straight face, I kid you not, that Jesus performed identical miracles so that he could purposely fit into already existing mythological narratives. He did this so that people would not be confused about whether or not he was God. So that they would be like, oh yeah, gods usually turn water into wine, so since he did that, he must be a god.
If we grant for the sake of argument that the God of the Bible exists, and he wants to reveal himself to humanity in the person of Jesus, why wouldn't he do so in ways that people understood by what it means to be a deity? For example, Jesus performed miracles to show he was divine, like calming the storms and demonstrating his power over the sea. The reason is, the Jews of the day only thought the Lord had this power. So if Jesus wanted to reveal he was God, we would expect him to do it in ways the people of his day would have understood divinity. He isn't going to turn himself into an Aztec serpent deity and fly through the sky. That might cause them to think he is a demon. Instead, he'll reveal his divinity in ways they already understood.
So there's a lot wrong with this view. Let's just consider two reasons why this is a horrendously short-sighted perspective on the narrative of Christianity. First is right off the bat, this assumes some validity in previous mythological narratives, which Christianity does not support. This assumes that the miracles that were performed previously were genuine miracles that Jesus could copy. It assumes that Jesus was performing identical things to other people in the past. And so what makes Jesus unique if he's just doing something that everybody else has already done before? Also, the logic here is horrendous. Basically, he's saying, I am God. I want to prove to everyone that I am God. So let me do exactly what everyone else has already done. This seems like the exact opposite of what you'd want to do if you're truly the Son of God or God incarnate. I think this is the biggest problem we run into when we're trying to raise Jesus to the level of some divine being. He's not original. He's not unique. He's doing things that other people have already done. He's simply a shaman of his time. He performed miracles that were absolutely specific to the setting and the time period that he was in. He was not doing anything out of the ordinary. But his main job was to mediate individuals' relationships to the unconscious mind. So was Jesus a myth? Absolutely, without a doubt. Does that mean he did not exist? No. Jesus, just like Gilgamesh, were real people that existed, but mythological narratives were built on top of them. A more explicit example of a modern myth is that of Adolf Hitler. In many ways, these two individuals are similar in that they are representations of large-scale, widespread functions of the human mind. Be sure to check out my most recent video about why Jesus, just like Hitler, should be categorized as a god. Be sure to like and subscribe for future videos talking about the mythological origins and nature of Christianity.